So first things first, I have activated a starter that I actually dehydrated from my starter from earlier in the year. I did sourdough for a lot of the winter and I absolutely loved it. But as soon as the days started to get warmer here, as the summer really started heating up, my sourdough started to overproof or over ferment quite readily, and that can happen in the heat. I decided just to go ahead and give up for the summer, but we're headed into fall and it's time to bring it back. So this is actually the first time that I have made bread in a really long time, and I'm really excited that you're here with me. So I'm actually using a recipe out of my sourdough cookbook. I love this thing. I'm gonna link it in the description box. And this is the recipe that we're making, the Farmhouse Country White. Now, if I'm gonna do something once, I kinda like to double the recipe, so I'm going to be doing that today. I do have 2 bread pans, and doubling the recipe works great for our 6-person family. As with most things sourdough, it's really smart to have a kitchen scale. Everything is more accurately done by weight. A lot of sourdough recipes are in grams, so I'm going to be setting my kitchen scale to weigh in grams. So I'm gonna be starting with 130 grams of bubbly active starter. Looks pretty good, smells amazing. I actually fed my starter and got this starter going at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. Right now it's 9 p.m. So for me, it's still a little bit hot here and it does not take long to get bubbly. So I'm actually gonna cover this and set it to the side, but I can't forget to feed it before I go to bed. Next, the recipe calls for 300 grams warm water. It does say in the bonus part at the bottom of the recipe that I can also use milk. Well, we happen to have a whole bunch of dairy goats down in the barn, and we have a lot of milk, so I like to use it when I can. I feel like it lends to a much richer loaf, and it gives me the excuse to use something from the farm. So I'm gonna be using about 2.5 cups. Now it's gonna be 600 grams, so I am still gonna weigh it, but right about 2.5 cups has been what's standard. Pro tip here, if you're going to be weighing out the volume of something, it's a good idea to weigh your vessel empty first, tear out or zero out the scale, and then put the liquid in. So I've got our 600 grams of milk here. I am going to want to at least bring it up to room temperature so that we don't retard the growth of the yeast. I'm gonna use my microwave for this, and usually it takes about 1.5 minutes to get nice and warm. I'm gonna stir it up, make sure that there's no hot pockets before I add it into my starter. Look at those bubbles. Oh, goodness. Gosh. 1 tablespoon of sugar. I'm doubling it, so I'm gonna do 2. 2 tablespoons of oil, or you could use butter. I don't have any butter thawed out. In total, because I am doubling the recipe, I'm using about 1 kilo of flour, which I think is around 2 pounds, right?
1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds.
2.2 pounds. So it's 800 grams of the bread flour, and then it's 200 grams of whole wheat flour. Whoop. If that happens to you, you can skim some off the top. There we go. And last but not least, 3 teaspoons of salt. And this is what we've got. Give everything a good mix. My mom actually got me this really cool dough spoon, or whatever it's called, and it kind of looks goofy. It looks like it wouldn't really have that much of an effect, or it would have a really strange, I don't know, mode of action. It works very, very well to get all of the ingredients incorporated without exactly turning it into just one big non-cohesive lump. Enough of the ingredients move through the middle to where they mix up very well, actually. So once I get the dough to this point, I like to go ahead in with my hands just to smooth things out a little bit. It smells awesome already. Basically focusing on scraping around the outside of the bowl and moving the dough towards the center of the dough ball. See what we got? Now it's not perfectly smooth at the moment. All of the flours are going to take a few minutes to really rehydrate with the liquids that we put in there. The recipe actually tells us to wait about 30 minutes to an hour, let things rehydrate, and then come back and smooth things out. So that's what we're gonna do. Cover with a wet towel and set it aside. So remember, I took out 130 grams and I want to put 130 grams straight back in. I like to keep everything pretty constant with my starter because I basically only make this soft bread. I will branch out, I'm sure, with inspiration from this collaboration into many more things, but I need to make sure that I feed my starter before I go to bed regardless. So as you can see, I'm currently using a mason jar for my starter, and that's because I didn't have any of my weck jars clean. These jars are actually my favorite jars to use for my sourdough. I can really get in there with my spatula, and there's a lot of room in here for my sourdough to double and grow. And because I use a lot of it, because of my double recipe, a size this big, this is 1 liter, is great. I'd say about every week to 10 days is when I will do this. I move my starter over to a clean jar and I wash the old one. A lot of the times the starter does get a little bit stuck on the edges, and I do get worried that it's gonna go bad if it's not in the middle of the mix, so I like to start fresh every so often. So it actually looks like I have about 190 grams of starter in here right now, and I'm going to want to basically double that with what I put in. So instead of just replacing the 130 grams that I took out, I'm actually going to put in 190 grams so our ratios can stay the same. The concern with underfeeding the sourdough starter is that it's going to burn through that feed really quickly, and it may have the potential to mold if it kind of stands unfed for too long. One of the biggest reasons that I avoided sourdough for so long was I felt like I wasted so much flour in the feeding. When I really wasn't ready to make bread, I still had to feed the starter, and it seemed like such a big waste to throw it away. Now, I know there's a whole bunch of discard recipes, but I also don't have an infinite amount of time to spend just cooking in the kitchen all day. I unfortunately don't have that kind of a life. But it actually was brought to my attention that I could actually feed my starter and then put it straight in the fridge, and it will continue to feed and ferment in the fridge. It just does so at a much slower rate. So oftentimes, even if I'm going to be making sourdough the very next day, what I'll do is feed the starter in the evening after I've started my bread, stick it straight in the fridge, and then around noontime, 2 o'clock the next day, I'll actually pull it out of the refrigerator, set it on the counter, and it probably at that time hasn't quite doubled yet. It has grown a little, but as it warms up on the counter, it will start to reactivate, and by the time I'm ready to make bread again, it's already doubled and I wouldn't have to have fed it again that morning. Make sure when you feed your sourdough that you are using a non-chlorinated water. You want to make sure that there's nothing in the water that's going to inhibit the growth of those yeasts. I actually have a Berkey water filter, and that's the water that I use. So the sourdough starter, after it's all mixed up and fed, should be the consistency of a really thick pancake batter. I think we've got it. One of the things I love most about these weck jars are the really pretty glass lids. And I just set it on top like this. The weck jars come with that rubber seal and the clamps. I don't use that at all. I just set the glass lid right on top of the glass jar, and that allows enough breathability without letting bugs or anything in. I also like to put a mark on my jar right where the sourdough starter starts out. Ideally, when the sourdough is ready to use, the starter will have at least doubled in size, and this helps give me a really good guide as to when that is. Okie dokie, so this is what we've got right now. It looks a little bit uneven, so what we're going to be doing is kneading it on the counter just a little bit to smooth everything out. this point, if you found that your bread was really sticking to the counter, I would suggest adding a little bit of a dusting of flour. You want to be able to mold the dough pretty well, but not have it be super sticky. So we've got a pretty nice, smooth-ish, mostly smooth dough ball here. This is absolutely perfect. So I'm gonna put it back in the same bowl here, cover it with the same moist towel, and let it rise overnight. And this is when we are gonna see a change in size in the dough. Good morning. So we're at the next day. We're actually right at the 10-hour mark since we initially mixed the dough together. That is probably the maximum amount of time I'd want to leave the dough this time of year. In fact, I noticed last night, because I was up for a couple hours, that my starter had actually doubled in 2 hours, which is a very quick turnaround for my starter. So I immediately put that in the refrigerator, and I actually stuck this bowl, which contains our dough, on my bathroom floor because my feet know that that is the coldest room in the house, and cold is going to help slow things down. So let's see what's in here. So we are nice and fluffy, but not overdone. Oftentimes you'll know if the dough is overproofed if it's not domed on top. So it has a nice convex top here, and it looks perfect. So now comes the fun part. We're going to shape the dough and get it in the loaf pans. Now don't forget, I have doubled the recipe here, so I'm going to be making 2 separate loaves. So I'm going to cut this in half. So in order to get the shape that I need for my dough pan, I actually need to flatten this out, but I don't want to destroy some of the air bubbles that are in there. Now, some of the bigger air bubbles, it's fine. If they pop, they're gonna just provide a little bit of an inconsistency in the finished product if they're not popped. So I'm just gonna take my fingers and poke down in. This is a nod to my days where I used to work at a pizzeria. I'm actually trying to a little bit stretch the dough into a shape that my book here taught me is going to be the easiest way to start out for a loaf. So this is what we've ended up with. Now that I've got that, I'm actually just going to start at the side closest to me and get it all rolled up. So we've got like a nice jelly roll log. If I see any air pockets at the top here, I'm actually just gonna pinch them open and pop them. Those are going to be towards the top of the loaf, and I don't want them to burn. Now I've got to tuck in the sides, kind of make a rainbow shape essentially. And this is what I'm looking for to set down into my pan. So I have 2 of these really awesome Lodge cast iron loaf pans. I have a very thin layer of a tasteless oil in here, and this is gonna be all I need. I don't need to add parchment paper or anything like that. These loaves are gonna come out really nicely. Whoops, she scooted down, but first one done. Get back in there. So I have added a little bit of flour to my working space and to the dough, but I don't want to over flour things. Excess flour will kind of remain on the dough itself and create not the best texture in my opinion. So just enough that it's not going to stick to the table, but I still kind of want it to stick to itself. So I've got my same towel from last night, and we've got another and final rise. So these are gonna sit on the counter here and rise in about 1 to 2 hours. This part is kind of variable. You wanna watch it. Essentially, if it starts to raise more than 1 inch above the pan, you definitely wanna just get it straight in the oven. So they've puffed up a little bit. It's been 2 hours. They're going to rise beautifully in our 375-degree oven. They're gonna be in there for around 40 to 45 minutes. I'm looking for a nice golden crust. I feel like I cannot be the only person in the world that requires the oven light be on when I put something in the oven. Let me know if that's you too. So now that we've got the bread loaves out of the oven, it's important that we let them sit in the pans for an additional 10 minutes. They're going to finish up cooking, and if I remove them from the pan too quickly, I do risk them sticking, so I'm gonna follow the directions and leave them for an additional 10 minutes. All right, now it's time to unmold them. I have this little spatula here that I like to glide down in between the bread and the pan just to make sure everything is good and freed up. But in general, they tend to lift right out. See, you can see a little bit of our fold creases there, but this is a really gorgeous homemade sourdough bread loaf. It's very, very tempting to cut into it while it's warm, and you can. I often do, but sometimes the bread still hasn't set and you can get a little bit of a gummier crumb that way. So we're going to try to follow the rules and let it cool before we cut into it and show you how amazing it is on the inside. All right, so it's definitely lunchtime. So without further ado, let's cut into these. When it comes to storage of the bread, it's important to note that homemade bread does not last as long as store-bought bread. There's not all of those stabilizing ingredients in the bread, and that's a good thing. So I like to keep my sourdough for no longer than 3 days, but it's definitely best on the day that it's made. I store it in a wrapped towel on the first day, but in subsequent days I like to put it in a plastic bag. If I had a bread box, I would use that. That would be just fine. It's also a little bit more dry and chewy on days 2 and 3, so I find that it's best to toast it on those days. Isn't it perfect? You can get relatively thin slices out of this. I probably could have sliced this even thinner. It's definitely sourdough. It's got that classic sourdough smell. Classic sourdough taste, really nice, warm, bouncy crumb. This is the thing that comfort food is made of.